Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is August 16, 2023. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here today with Renée Petropoulus. Renée, where in the heck are you calling in from?
I'm in Venice, California.
Well, that's pretty rare where we're both in Venice. The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
When you say thing, what do you, I guess thing becomes an object in some ways.
Yeah, so this is good starting right off the bat. Like I say, you put it into the context you want. So again, you win because that's what this series is all about, is inventing new questions. So right off the bat, you are like, well, what do you mean by thing? So it is like, yeah, it's like collectively we can sort of feel what the word thing infers, but you can put it into any context that you want, whether it's physical or non-physical or, verbal or nonverbal. Yeah.
Well, I actually, now if we're getting involved with words and kind of phrasing, I think of thing as both object and subject. And
Yeah.
I think of thing in a sort of multitude of ways, and maybe the writer that sort of made me really think about that, let's say more radically, was Rainer Maria Rilke in his book Notebooks, the Notebooks for Malta Lurid's Brig, and he puts the word thing in quotations throughout the book. And it struck me that he's materializing something. And even though it's not an image and there's no way to really kind of visualize it, it became solid. And that I maybe read that 30 years ago or so. And it profoundly sort of made me think about history, the work I was doing, the way that I translated constantly between different mediums, between thought, text, image, all of those, and how kind of fluid and difficult simultaneously that is.
No, that was great. And everything comes full circle. We touch back on it. So what's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
Probably, that's so hard. I wrestle with that it comes in both through words and through images, but I'm always filtering images through words or through ideas. So it comes in that way. I think secondarily it comes in audibly because I use a lot of sound in my work, and I started giving my painting soundtracks about 20 years ago and started really thinking about looking at something and hearing something. And it stemmed from maybe the beginning of that device, the Walkman. And I started noticing people walking around my neighborhood, listening rather than looking. Yeah. And they were kind of creating a soundtrack for where they were walking. Maybe they were looking. I probably shouldn't be quite so definitive about that, but they weren't hearing the sounds that matched up to what they were looking at. And so they were making their own soundtrack. And I just kept thinking about that. So I brought it into my own work in the early 2000s to experiment with looking at something and having then a sonic experience simultaneously.
Really well put. And it just evoked, I ride my bike a lot on sidewalks carefully because I don't want to be hit by a car. And so people who walk on sidewalks and stare at their cell phones are not navigating the urban setting. They're like, dude, stay on one side of the street or be more aware that you're not looking where you're walking. In fact, in New York City, they were going to make it illegal to text and walk at the same time because people for years got hit reading newspapers walking down the street. And then they're like, we're not going to pass a law that's texting your cell phone. But the other thing about words is, I know you have books there. You reference an author right off the bat, and you reference writers. Did you become a reader, one, because your parents told you to, two, because they did it as an example, or on your own?
All three.
Okay.
And I grew up in a house with a lot of books.
Yeah.
And I grew up in a house with people who spoke multiple languages. And reading books was a way, in many ways, was a way to pass the months of the summer. I spent a lot of time reading every year for the months of the summer. And it was,
Great.
I was just driven to that.
Great. Why do you think humans collect or gather information?
To stave off death.
Really good. Do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate or more invented?
I would say it's cultivated in many ways. I think you started with the word things, and we talked a little bit about objects. And this question brings me back to that, in that collecting is an impulse, but one has to respect objects. If you don't respect the object, you're probably aren't interested in collecting it. And so it becomes a kind of conversation between objects and the impulse, the sense of collecting things to understand them, to appreciate them, to have them be sort of interwoven in one's life.
Yeah. I have to shut this phone off. I got to excuse myself for 1 second, please. Sorry. I try to remember how to do everything properly and I flubbed, so forgive. But this next question is, do thoughts create emotions?
Well, you're asking, this question goes back, I feel, to my childhood, or maybe a little beyond my childhood, but when I was, a fairly young person, thinking about, can we actually think something without words? That words are the only way, or the only thing we've kind of agreed upon with to communicate together. And even if they're really inaccurate and maybe even stumbling blocks in so many ways, I feel that they are what we as a society have agreed upon to use in order to begin to understand one another.
Yeah.
So they're kind of linked. They're linked to thought. I don't know, how can you think something if you don't have the words? I mean, I can see making a gesture. I can see a gesture supplanting words. That movement using a kind of embodied action could be or is radically different than using words. And then we'll use words to interpret that. but I'm not sure we have to.
Well, you must have ESP, because the next question is, can humans think without language?
I'm not sure. It's a struggle. I've always wondered about that. I would probably have said no at one point. Um, and I think I lean that way because I don't know how else we do it or how we can pull that off. I did admit that I think gesture or movement, contact, physical contact, is another form or an added form to complete communication. Um, but I don't know if that supplants thinking.
Yeah. No, I appreciate this, because you get it. I'm asking these questions just as prompts for dialogue. And sometimes people think, like Rebecca Solnit said it so well, just because you ask me a question doesn't mean I have to answer it. And I'm not even expected that. I'm just hoping that we can have dialogue, because I'm like the opposite. Did you answer the question? So when someone says I can't answer that, or I don't know, I'm even more happy because they're willing to say that without feeling like I'm trying to get you or put you on the spot. Like, can you answer this one? So you really get what I'm after. Here's fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I
don't know what I think until I think it.
Well, that's fine.
I mean, there was you're reminding me, and I'm thinking about a description that I heard about the writer thinker Hannah Arendt.
Yeah.
And somebody was describing being in her seminar years and years ago, and that the exciting part, the brilliant part of being in the seminar was to watch her think.
Yeah.
That she literally embodied thinking in front of the group. And I think once I heard that, it was freeing in some ways.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I kind of got it on a really deep level that made so much sense to me.
That makes a lot of sense. I love that. And I'm glad you taught me that. And this whole thing is, can we, I don't know what I think until what McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. But it's endless what I get. I don't know what I think until I think it. Now, Chomsky says a language is not just words. It's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
Well, I would agree with Chomsky that, and I think that I was saying it less eloquently earlier, that I do think it is what we have, let's say, accepted to be civilized. I guess that's it. It's a kind of idea of community as civilization.
Yeah.
That through words, you could, you mentioned Joan Didion. I'm kind of jumping for a second, but in one of her more recent books, when she was speaking about death, the death of her husband, daughter, she speaks about Emily Post, and that she never realized that manners and etiquette are a way to get through grief and get through the kind of emotional state that one might be in after that kind of loss. And it really struck me that having civilization or having certain kinds of rules, it may not be adequate, but it is a way that we can process, or a way that we can respect one another.
Yeah. Yeah, Lily Tomlin says reality's just a collective hunch. And
I
you know,
like that. I
and
love that.
it's sort of like what I'm after. Your hunch, your guess, your impulse. Some of these questions people go, well, I'm not a neuroscientist. I can't answer that. I said, well, just what's your hunch? What's your
Yeah,
guess?
yeah,
And
yeah.
so this is your observations of humans in general. Are we more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
I don't know if I could even divide us between those two kind of poles.
Yeah.
Um, I can't do that. I think it's completely interwoven, and some of it is very, very unconscious, and then some of it is very conscious as
Yeah.
well. So it's that kind of ricocheting, a kind of movement uh, between us um, as human beings. Yeah, I
That's
mean,
what that's George Lake. What you just said, George Lakoff's neuroscientists say we're operating on an 80% subconscious level. I
yeah,
feel we're both here 100% pretty much, but it's still, we don't know. But the other thing is, it's a stupid question. Are we more feeling or thinking? You know what most people say? I think we're more feeling. 80% of people literally go, I think we're more feeling. Now, the thing is, we invented the words feeling and thinking. So
yeah.
we think we can separate them, but we can't. It's like this. So these are two questions from Alan Turing in 1950s. One, is thinking a function of the soul?
Well, you'd have to believe we have a soul first. so so that's a I haven't thought enough about that as an aspect, but I do think um, if we think of the soul as emotional, like it's an emotion, um, I'm not sure I know what a soul is, and I'm
Yeah,
not sure I really have deeply kind of contemplated it. I've sort of I know or I recognize how it's invoked, but to really how do I put it to sort of engage it. I don't think I can do that yet. Maybe
that's all
I
right.
in the
That's
future.
fine.
No,
Yeah,
no,
that's
I'm interested in the question.
yeah,
I'm interested in
yeah.
thinking about it.
But you'll see a lot of these themes come back around. You'll see. So the second Turing question is, can machines think?
Uh, I would say no.
Yeah,
I mean, he asked that so early on. I mean, yes, I think it was he probably knew there were some computer type entities already then in the
yeah,
50s, but not. No, I think humans programmed them.
yeah,
So so they on their own can't do it. But I think if our quote human genius is able to input enough, they will simulate it. But
yeah.
I don't no, I don't think they on their own thing.
Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Meaning I will answer it as meaning. I want to pursue happiness more than meaning. And maybe that's coming. That's all I can say. But I tend to choose meaning first.
Good, good positive attitude. I agree. But I got it from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He says happiness doesn't necessarily last, meaning tends to last. So,
Yeah.
there's no right or wrong answers. There's no
No,
right, but you got that one right. That's what I was going to say.
that's really funny. 'Cause we're in a time where I think maybe not so different, but the terms are, let's say, erupting into again trying to define truth or
Yeah,
trying to define what meaning is. And you know, maybe we could speak to, you know, the last 50 years of invoking initially sort of questions around signs, right,
Yeah.
and signification, and initially understanding them as fixed, and then beginning to understand them as not fixed. I mean, when they were called symbols, then they were fixed. And once that language changed in the, you know, 50s, I think, around somewhere in there with Barth and Foucault, you know, people thinking about signs, I I think we, by changing the language, we began to change our thinking about them.
Yeah.
And now they're, I think, in a state of enormous flux because they're not agreed upon
Yeah.
in any way. They slide to such a degree.
Yeah. Yeah, somebody goes, "Brandy." I go, "You mean the pop star or the alcoholic drink?" They go, they go, "Jesus." I go, "You mean the God or the TV series?" So, so
Well, no, it's yeah, it's and it what is interesting, maybe not in that one exactly, but let's say there's a streaming thing called Goliath, and of course they use the term Goliath in its historical evocation, right? The big thing against the small guy, right? That
yeah,
the small guy can, you know, can win the battle, as it were. Uh, so they're relying on it, but at another moment, it wouldn't be that, you know. And
yeah,
that's where the grounds that we're standing on, and I put it in plural, grounds, uh, become really treacherous in many
yeah.
ways.
Really well put, Renee. This is great. I really appreciate your time and especially how articulate you are. You know, the word truth came up, and
Yeah.
Louis Buñuel said, "I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it." Now, 90% of people 90% of people I say that to, they go, "That's great." And one person finally goes, "That's bullshit." Because if I'm going to seek something, it's because I want to find it. So I sort of morphed it into this question. If the journey is more important than the destination, why do we have to name or seek a destination?
Well, that's it. You know who introduced me to that was really Henry Miller. I think it was, I can't remember if it was in Tropic of Cancer or Tropic of Capricorn, but it was all about the journey rather than the destination, right? And and being a visual artist, I have always been interested in the way that process works. Like when one is involved in a process, it is not only the end result that one is seeking. It is the action, the activity, the journey
Yeah,
again. You know, and I see that I've been doing performance for the last decade or so, quite a bit of it, and I rely on improvisation within structure. You
yeah,
know, the idea of you set the structure, but within it, you don't really know, or I don't really know how it's going to work. And each time something's performed, it's different, but yet it's the same as well. So that idea of the journey is essential to me.
yeah,
So I would, yeah, the journey.
yeah. Well,
Journey.
it's also psychogeography, or Walter Benjamin morphing it into flaneur. These people changed the world forever in Paris, and all they did was sit around in coffee houses and do nothing. You know, sort of like what we do in Venice.
That again, aren't we seeking that as a way of being?
Well, that's what I do every day when I go down to the boardwalk in Venice. So, but let's go. Does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away, and are we more so detecting it or more so creating it?
Probably would have, I would have to say I feel like I discover it or detect
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are things there, and it's always fascinating to me when somebody says something or I read something and identify with it, because then it's not so much that I created it. I begin to recognize it,
Yeah.
and I'm so, let's say, pleased in many ways that I'm not alone.
Yeah.
And I think it actually serves to feel connected in
Yeah.
that recognition.
It's good. Audre Lorde, the poet, said, "You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools." Yvonne Rainer responded and said, "You can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?"
Hmm. I am familiar with both those quotes. And uh, there's also a third one, I think.
Please tell me.
Che Guevara says you have to be in the belly of the beast in order to make any kind of change. I am paraphrasing. It was a little more
Yeah.
succinct than what I just said, but that the idea is you can only do something if you're inside of it.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't know, maybe rephrase that. I mean, we're just
Well,
asking.
here's it's like amazing because a lot of people want to apply the quotes. Just because I drop a cute quote before the
Yeah,
question,
yeah,
the basic question is, you don't have to put the quote in the context of the basic question is, what tool do you gravitate towards? If you want to apply the word new, that's fine. And if you want to apply it to the master's house, exposing the tools, or dismantling the master's house. But I got to tell you one thing, Renee, the Shea quote's great because it reminds me of Zappa. Frank Zappa said the same thing. You only can change things by working within the system,
yeah.
but it's all good because it's both ends. But that was good. I'm glad you taught me that Shea quote. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you it is, yeah, to be outside of something. I don't buy it in that way. You know, I think one is inside of it, and the tools. I mean, I grew up in a time where I feel I was taught certain tools that I'm not sure are being taught so much now.
Yeah.
And in my teaching, I've always tried to teach in this way where you really look at context and you continually look at context, because meaning is not on its own, it's derived from context.
Yeah.
If something is situated in one place, its significance, its meaning comes from exactly where it's placed, and where you encounter it. And, kind of had the early education, back in the 70s, of really, like, when you look at a newspaper, what's the article next to the one you're reading? What are you seeing there that you're seeing right next to it? And what happens when you perceive them, in that way? And that, to me, is the beginning of critical thinking, the
Yeah.
beginning of being able to say, okay, I'm walking down the street and I see that, and then I turn and I see that.
Yeah.
That juxtaposition is crucial.
Yeah.
It's not an accident. It's not something to be ignored. And then maybe that goes back to when we were talking a little bit about the idea of a soundtrack, the idea
Yeah.
of affecting one's environment by conditioning it to that degree. And the ability to condition everything today is enormous.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really a stunning thing
Yeah.
to be able to block out, to be able to compartmentalize, to be able to just completely isolate. And I kind of didn't grow up thinking that way, and I still don't think that way. And I think that's a way where you lose the essence of what is true.
Yeah. It's really good what you said. Thank you. Because it was sort of evokes Gestalt the hidden ground, the environment, and you use the word context. Because
Yeah.
one of my favorite art pieces ever was Laurie Anderson took the front page of the Chinese New York Times and the American New York Times and cut it in strips and wove it together. And then McLuhan just nailed it. He said, "You can't write the great American novel because the front page of the newspaper is the great American novel," which is every time I go to AOL to see my stupid emails, I see the headlines before I get to see my letters. And I'm like, oh no. But you just like, there's no way to avoid it. It's like standing, I spent half my life at Lincoln in Venice waiting for the light change on my bicycle. So what does my brain see? Billboards. I have to see the billboards. There's no, I can't go like this, And so that was really well put. Um, what's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
um, Probably speed of thought's going to be faster than speed of light.
There you go. You got another one. That's the right answer. No, I love it when people say, 80% of people say speed of light. So I love it when they say speed of thought.
It takes forever for light to get here.
Yeah, hello.
Like that
Okay,
star, old light. It was from, a long time ago.
Yeah.
Finally hit
Okay,
me.
Renee, what new toy do you suggest?
A new toy.
Yeah, because this is funny because I kept asking people what new tool do you suggest? And someone said, well, how about a toy? So then I added it and I say tool and then I say toy. So again, you can put it in any context you want.
I guess I always think of, I want to be, a funny person or a humorous person or use my humor more readily. And than I think I do. And so a toy, I guess I don't play that much. And maybe that's another thing to think about. When you asked about happiness or play, I tend to, I think, not pursue that in the way that I would pursue the tool.
Yeah. That's all right. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Ooh, I don't worry at all when I go to bed at night. I really have no worries when I go to bed at night. I love going to bed, to sleep. I love it. And I generally don't have many problems with it. But but that question is intriguing because I tend to be one who does shove away most things, and I don't like to encounter the news before I go to bed. I like to read. I tend to like to read words that I don't know, are in a sense poetic, I guess you could say. A kind of language that is evocative and I can go to sleep thinking about it.
That's smart. McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions. So we might learn how to cope with what we don't like about our inventions. So, Renee, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Well, because they don't fit in all the time. And so when things don't fit in, they tend to be feared.
Yeah.
They tend to be pushed away. So I think I also grew up under McLuhan, and a lot of my, early experience in university, he was in vogue. The medium is the message, things like that. That was a very powerful re-understanding of
Yeah.
information. And that, kind of gave birth for me to context, to
Yeah.
uh, what I would now maybe call relational
Yeah.
activity,
Yeah.
activity that sits in relationship to others,
Yeah.
to a dialogue, to a back and forth. You could, even take it to call and response, which, is in different places in our society. Um, I I feel those are all aspects of this idea of context, or in some ways, the early sort of movements or moments and fluxes or conceptual art had a lot to do with the way one situated
Yeah.
themselves, right? And the word in situ came out of that, right?
Yeah.
So I do think those conditions for me have been extremely important. And
Yeah.
this idea of the antenna of the artist or something, I'm mixed about it in certain ways, especially now. And I think if one really takes being an artist seriously and understands its social responsibility in many ways, and I don't mean that you make something in a certain way when I say that. I mean that uh, it has a place socially, to make work that has a voice.
Yeah.
And it has, I think, historically been incredibly significant. Uh, but it's different, in, I think, in different eras. When one, in a time where people were virtually illiterate to text, the visual supplanted that, or supplied that. Right? You got to hear the story orally, verbally, that went along with the picture.
Yeah.
And once we've, become what one would say a literate society, in many ways, we have shed that. We don't necessarily match those things up, and nor do we desire to.
Yeah.
We're interested in dissonance. We're interested in, a kind of contradiction. We're interested in the way that functions. And I think as we continue to work and experience, these things change.
Yeah.
I don't think they're fixed in that way. And, the idea of the avant-garde that was so kind of prevalent as a thought and as a kind of, I think, going along with that statement, and that was 20th century thinking, right?
Yeah.
19th century thinking, that wasn't the case.
Right.
It was not seen that way. Maybe very end of the 19th century. But this idea that the artist was ahead, was able to signal, was able to see, um, I I think came from what we spoke about earlier in putting things together.
Yeah.
That when you look at the world, you put them together. You don't separate everything. Things are not necessarily distilled. So
Yeah.
I think that's something. I'm not sure that that's happening in the same way at this very moment. I
Yeah.
think that there's a kind of collapse of information. Maybe that's an over information. We have access to more information than we ever have in the history of the world.
Yeah.
Yet it feels that we really can't handle it for the most
Yeah.
part. It's too much. It's too much information. There's no synthesis. There's no way to decipher it. It sits there in piles.
Yeah. No, there's one way to decipher it, and that is you read Finnegan's Wake out loud with a group of people, and it satirizes the sensory overload that we're swimming in. So anything that satirizes that sensory overload makes us aware. Now, you describing McLuhan was outstanding, because it's hard to get McLuhan, and you really understood this idea of relationships and relational and understanding. That's what ecology is, the organisms relationship with its environment. But you know, you evoked Martha Graham. She said the great artists aren't ahead of their times; they are their times.
Yeah.
So that's pretty heavy. Do artists have moral obligation?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I could ever place that on them. No, I mean,
Yeah,
it's a great idea, but there have been, many artists who were, as I say, rather hideous as human beings.
yeah,
But they made quite interesting and provocative work. Uh, I think that still goes on, and I think that there's been an incredible shift, and that's why I mention taking the practice of art, the investment in living a life as an artist very seriously,
yeah,
because I think there's been a shift to it being a speculative, market-driven activity, and then that's a whole other thing.
yep,
That's a bunch of stuff. That's a lot of stuff that is called art because it is visual,
yeah.
but I can't say for sure that it is, in the way that I have historically thought about it.
Yeah, Renee, you get it because you know everybody says, "Do artists have moral obligation?" They'll go, "Everyone has a moral obligation." Yeah, they have an obligation to themselves, but to actually say no is immense because I asked Mike Kelly all these questions two different times, 10 years apart, and when he died,
Yeah.
the obit in the New York Times said one art critic said his art makes me feel soiled. It's like you don't go to art to make yourself feel soiled. And it was like that was, the intensity of his art. It wasn't like pleasant or
No,
nice. And so are you
no,
more
but
go ahead.
Jerry, neither were the visions in the Renaissance on a ceiling of the apocalypse.
Right.
They're terrifying. Those are
Right.
the scariest images in the world. If you believe,
Right.
they're terrifying.
Bruegel and yeah, all that. Yeah, there's lots of that. Yeah.
And so I think historically we've gone through, images have functioned really differently
Yeah.
and perform really differently. They,
Yeah.
are we maybe now in a, a state or a stage that's maybe more similar to the quote golden age of Dutch art,
Yeah.
where art served as a measure for your wealth, served as a measure for your
Yeah.
position,
Yeah.
right? Within a kind of middle class society. It wasn't about its religious overtones, which was
Yeah.
another area. But in the in this kind of golden age, the idea was to show your status
Yeah.
via what you acquired. And I
Yeah.
think we're quite the same place, but ours is not about the work in many ways. It's about the speculation of its value,
Yeah.
right? So
That's
this
right.
is a little different. Then it was really about, I think, its value as a symbol, but
Yeah.
it was not speculated upon in
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah. Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
I try not to be afraid.
Good.
I try to, I really do. I try not to be afraid. I
Good.
tend to be a bit of on a delay when it comes to that.
Can you conjure up your earliest memory or one of them?
But I've got worst memories. I mean, not worst memories. I'm very poor at remembering things, and I have to say I go a little bit. I follow a little bit in the steps of Barth with, like camera lucida. Like I need a photograph and then the
Yeah.
memories come back.
Yeah.
I have trouble kind of pulling them all up by myself and
Yeah.
really rely on an image. Sebald or people who really like they use an image. I'm one of those, but when I think, I tend to think in words rather than
Yeah.
in images. I will say that, and that I know is a little bit unusual for a visual artist.
Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
I think memory is a blessing.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't want to forget things. I think it's important to remember them, or you constantly do repeat them.
Yeah.
And the horrors of the world are so repetitive,
Yeah.
basically.
Tell me someone within your immediate family, then
Mhm.
outside your immediate family, just briefly, who had an impact on you, kind of like a role model. And what specifically was that impact?
Um, I think in my family, it was my mother and maternal grandmother who were maybe had the biggest impact. And
What'd you mainly get from them?
ideas of independence,
Yeah.
ideas of being receptive to different thoughts, to recognizing uh, an idea of relativity, an idea of context.
Yeah.
Yeah, really
Wow.
context. So
Beautiful.
I got that from them.
Now outside your immediate family, someone.
Outside my immediate family, I will say immediately, there are several people, but one in particular is someone I taught with for 7 years, and we co-taught a seminar. Um, and that experience uh, absolutely uh, changed my thinking. And our relationship of being able to provide and nurture discourse for a sustained amount of time, usually 6-7 hours straight, uh, was a was a revelation, and to allow for great and long moments of silence so that people really could think. So it wasn't about being in, let's say, immediately on top of things. It was a wrestling of
Yeah.
ideas. So that person, am I supposed to say who they are or
Well,
something?
it's your choice. You could say their name if you want. No,
Okay.
that wrestling, it's almost like the gap is where the action is. It's a resonating interval. 6 hours and you'd allow for silence. That was beautiful. Did your parents raise you? Oh,
I
go
mean,
ahead.
let me just say this because I feel like why that was such a profound experience is that I maybe was raised in some ways to fill up silence,
Yes.
to make sure there wasn't much of it so that no one was uncomfortable. I mean, in a
Yeah.
sense, kind of good manners or something.
Yeah.
And this allowed me to see and to shed a lot of that.
It's good.
Not completely, but it really introduced me to, no, you can stand there and think and
Yeah.
in public. You can be quiet with a group of people and only come forward when you're ready to.
Yeah. Thelonious Monk said silence is the loudest sound in the universe.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite musicians.
That.
And I love
Did, did
his
your parents raise you a particular religion?
um I did not go to any kind of uh, religious schooling of any kind. My family was Jewish, but I didn't go to temple or anything like that,
Do you
and
pray?
only for parking.
That is great. Only for park. Beautiful. If God exists, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
Have some fun.
Oh my God. Finally, someone with that's beautiful. You know what everybody says. You did a
No.
good job. Well, 80% of people say you did a good job. Now a lot of people are saying welcome home. But come on, I mean, have some fun is great. Okay.
I actually think we eh, we are losing a sense of pleasure,
Yeah,
and we really need to cultivate it. I mean, like
yeah,
deeply cultivate that.
yeah.
And not and pleasure is not singular. It's not one thing, but we really I mean, I think there are people writing about this and thinking about it, but we as seriously as I think, I want to take my activities, my practice as an artist, I really believe that we have to uh, examine where we find pleasure and really and try to embrace it as much as possible.
Totally. I agree completely. Do evil people exist or does evil use people as a vehicle?
It exists. You're absolutely
Well, they're really the hidden question, Renee, is how do
yeah.
you how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And I'll set it up. Alan Watts says, if you
Mm.
acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurais, keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Yeah.
JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
I'm I definitely think there's a lot there. In that single sentence. I was writing something this morning, and it was really, I think, looking not so much at an enemy, but what you keep close to you and what you kind of push away.
Yeah.
And I I I think I've come to, maybe a point in my life, because I do think we're not always the same. We're the same and we're not the same, very profoundly not the same. Given our age, you really are different at different stages. And I don't, I'm not really very interested anymore in convincing somebody of something.
Yeah.
I am less and less interested in that. Um, and I feel like in a funny way, I don't even have time to do that.
Yeah.
I did it a lot, and I would fight or kind of be emboldened in that way, and try to shed some light or enlightenment, as it were. But I don't feel that
Yeah.
really so much anymore. I I think it's yeah, it's worth it, I guess, but I'm in a really different way, in a
Yeah.
really different way, and maybe even in a slightly different type of language,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin about 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism.
Yeah,
Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
because I think that goes back to the consciousness. Some of the best theater I've seen in recent years, and most of it's come out of the global South, and maybe more specifically South America. And it comes, I think, in some ways from the significant teachings of Augusto Boal and Paulo Freire, who really, like, when you have somebody enact something, it changes them.
Yeah,
And it's not only for the audience, it's, I
yeah,
think, for the performer,
yeah,
for the inhabitor of that.
yeah.
And so that's the reason. I think representation has become really significant, I think, for identity, and seeing oneself, and beginning to understand oneself. And for me, I think really theater might be one of the more important places where that takes place, some type of performance activities where there is literally the embodiment we were talking about earlier, or um, the thing that's not always words, but it's gestures, it's
Yeah.
movement, it's sound, it's all of those kinds of things.
So well put. I'm on question number 12, and question number 90 quotes Augusto and Paulo in the theater of the oppressed. And listen, it's so good how you put it, your words, and how they say they use theater as a means of promoting social and political change. The audience becomes active, actors, instead of actors, and explore, show, analyze, and transform the reality in which they are living. So, what I love is tried to study what was the first human invention ever. And Augusto and Paulo say theater. That could be the first human invention ever. So I think you really got that question. Now, why don't you walk us through, Renée, kind of the tipping points where you said, I want to be an artist? Are you going to art galleries as a kid, or your art museums, and then you're seeing art, and then you go in high school, you go, I'm going to study art, or college? Where was that tipping point? Is that's my calling?
You know, that I've thought about a lot, and I don't ever remember not knowing about art. I did go to museums from, I don't know, from being a kid, and I
Yeah.
took art classes, I don't know, from the age of 7 on or something, so I mean, I was always doing I had a little studio at my house. It was
Yeah.
built behind the garage. It was really like a potting shed that I turned into a studio. So, but I never thought you could be an artist.
Yeah.
So this is a weird kind of conundrum. I was around it. I knew about it. I'd even been introduced to people who were artists, but I never felt I could say that until I could. And
Yeah.
that took a long time into my early 20s.
But what
So
was that tipping point that enabled you to say, I can? Was it post college or during college?
I think it was kind of in the middle of graduate school, maybe even a little bit, maybe kind of after.
Yeah.
After I felt, I mean, I started as undergraduate, I was an art history major because I knew I wanted to be near art,
Yeah.
around art.
Yeah.
So I started university as an art history major,
Yeah.
uh, with a, kind of extra concentration in both history and film.
Yeah.
I was firmly in the humanities, but I I never I just didn't. Yeah, I felt like such a privilege to be an artist that I wasn't ready to say I was one until I had practiced to some degree and felt that I was ready to. So
What was that tipping point to engage in film or video when
um,
artists, you were talking about art history, it's generally painting and sculpture and
yeah.
architecture. Where was there a tipping point for saying, I want to engage, part of my medium is going to be film?
Well, what happened, I think, was that I saw such a profound division between the art department and the art history department. And art historians didn't seem to be acknowledging or looking at the practicing artists that were in the same building. It was like two different worlds. They shared a library, but they were two different worlds.
Wow.
And uh, it kind of kept, kind of struck me that it was such a weird thing to be an art historian and not engage the way that the artists who write in, proximity were looking at things.
Yeah.
And I felt that there was a lack in many of the art historians in terms of the way they looked at things or saw things. That it wasn't with an eye to really fusing things together. And then I have to say that kind of for the end of the 70s, some of that changed. And it was primarily, I think, a kind of Marxist look at art history.
Yeah.
Now, once you realize you had to look at the social, you had to look at the lives, you had to look at all of that in order to kind of construct what this stuff really was.
Really, yeah.
And that was, I think, kind of materialism of Marx, who
Yeah.
filtered in. And then, in addition, was the translation of many pieces of writing that took years to be you didn't see Barthes or Foucault until the 70s, even if they were written in the 50s.
Yeah.
They were not translated into English until much, much later. So
Yeah.
that thinking didn't become available.
Yeah.
In the same way, unless you spoke the other language. And I mean,
Yeah.
there were people who I think did, but
Yeah.
many people didn't as
Yeah.
well.
Well, it's interesting because a screenwriting teacher told me great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker.
I'm going with Kubrick.
What role does intention play in your creative process when you're making your art?
I really am, founded much of my practice, as much as I think it comes out of the histories of painting and sculpture. It's really founded on the early conceptual thinkers, conceptual art thinkers.
Yeah.
So maybe on the lineage, if we look at the 20th century as maybe the let's say the clearest divide, you have the trajectory of Picasso and the trajectory of Duchamp.
Yeah.
And maybe now we're in a point where they're fusing, those two lines of thinking. But I would have said my foundation was more in Duchamp in many ways, in positing an idea, and that's where the art could reside. But I'm also really interested in the way the visual functions. So then I have that other part, I think going on. But I think the foundation, I would, kind of came up at the time when that stuff was just happening. Was what was happening. And even if it wasn't fully in the educational systems, it still isn't in many schools.
Yeah.
It's still they're really in a Beaux-Arts model,
Yeah.
And I think, that luckily is something that I avoided to be fully.
It's what I did too, is like once I hit Duchamp, I realized there's nothing post Duchamp. Sorry. Banksy, Warhol, it doesn't matter anybody. They're all Duchamp wannabes. All the power to them. Banksy just got on CBS Sunday Morning this past Sunday. If you didn't see it, it's 10 minutes. It's very revealing to see straight news talk about him right now. And so you have the ESP because that's the next question. Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your audience when you're making your art, or your viewer or your participant, your consumer of your art? How much are you thinking of them? Yeah.
I think of my viewer enormously. And but in different kinds of ways. I think of the site, like where the work is received. As I said, I I work sometimes in what one would call the public sphere. You
Yeah.
know, you encounter the work as you're doing other things.
Yeah.
Um, I work, you know, in galleries or museums, and then I work also. How do I put it? In performance, which is time based and live.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would say those are the three areas, and my mediums, you know, are varied within those three areas. Uh, so I think of my audience within those contexts.
Yeah.
Context has been, I think, the driving force.
Yeah.
My work of where something is, how do you see it, where do you stand and see it, how is it perceptually experienced, is it really thin, do you see it from the side, do you walk along it, do you, you know, like all of those are considerations when I make a work. uh,
That's
yeah.
good. And you get it. I'm really digging this. This is deep. So let's take one of your tools, say the moving image camera, whether it's film or video. McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness or human sensorium. So knife and fork extends our teeth. The shutter in a camera or projector extends our eyelid. Even non-tangibles, say philosophy or religion, might extend consciousness. What does the moving image camera, whether it's film or a video camera, extend for you? What humanness does it extend?
um, I would say increasingly it extends time
Yeah.
uh, and duration. I'm, you know, in the process of making a film that'll be 5 hours and 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Now, that's a ridiculous amount of time,
Yeah.
on one hand.
Yeah.
What I'm interested in is something akin to an experience I had a number of years ago when I was traveling. I was in Indonesia in the early 80s, and I experienced a shadow puppet event, which was all night. It was about 12 hours.
Yeah.
And in that event, uh, what was profound to me was how many people knew, you know, they knew the story. They didn't really need anyone telling them the story. They were there for the experience of it,
Yeah.
to watch it. And they were eating, sleeping, going in and out, talk, you know, like all of it was happening
Yeah.
simultaneously. And you sat on one side or you sat on the other. You either saw the shadow or you saw the actual puppet. You had the sound. And I was just dumbfounded by the fullness of allowing oneself to be within the performative.
Yeah.
So I think that is another moment of having incredible effect on
Yeah.
my thinking about performance. And
Yeah.
in that way, I mean, you know, kind of getting then involved with the way that improvisation works
Yeah.
within a structure.
No, you really get it. I go to the Ann Arbor Film Festival every year for it's 60 years old, over 60 years old, and 30 years I've gone. And I always go, you know, you're like Tuesday through Sunday, it's 7 hours, 8 hours a day. And in the festival for me is in the lobby when you're talking with your friends between the films. Because it's all this, it's like the context and the environment. It's so much like that. And in one of the and you brought up story, one of the greats in experimental film, Hollis Frampton, said, narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because we're waiting to die. And it's almost what you said at the beginning, you know, which really got me. You said something about, you know, to stave off death.
Yeah.
And so, can you forget to die?
Mhm. Well, I don't know if you can forget to die, but you can. I mean, this is I really never thought much about death until more recently. And now I think about it a lot, possibly because, I'm getting to an age where, oh, I may not be here in X amount of time. Whereas, I don't know, years ago, I never even thought about it. And of course,
Yeah.
it could happen as easily, as quickly, as dramatically at any point in time.
Yeah.
I didn't think about it. And I do know people that said they've been thinking about it since they were like 8 years old. And they've
Yeah.
never stopped thinking about it. I
Yeah.
was not one of those people.
Yeah.
So I did not do that. But I try not to have it, be a dictate as such. But I'm fascinated with how one's thinking and feeling change in time. And to the idea of positing a 5 hour and 15-minute film that for most people will be so boring they won't even be able to stand it.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Like, I'm kind of like, okay, I've always considered my audience and I'm considering them, but I'm interested in them suspending,
Yeah.
let's say, their perceptions and their experience in the way that it's in real time. That's why it's that long. It's exactly the amount of time it takes for something to happen. And so it's less narrative in that way. The voiceover will maybe touch on various narratives, but it isn't about what you see in that way. That's more of a continuum. So in that way, maybe I would liken it to something structuralist. You set up the conditions, and then you go for it.
Yeah.
And that's maybe another aspect of my thinking is like, how do you get rid of making decisions? You impose them. You set up something, and then you just do it within that amount of time. And
there you go.
So I very much influenced by those kinds of thinkers, and I'm kind of revisiting people like Robbe-Grillet, not a structuralist, but I'm revisiting that way of experiencing reading.
Yeah.
Right. That kind of detail that on one hand doesn't really propel the narrative at all, yet it's so consuming, and I'm interested in that and revisiting some of that writing and thinking.
Yeah, I think the idea of slow cinema, or bar, and especially Tarkovsky, but more so, I just hope it doesn't do when Chris what's his name? Now I can't think of his last name. The guy who made Chris Marker's got it. Christian Marquet made The Clock, the 24-hour film, and you could go and watch 1 hour, 2 hours, or sit through it for 5 hours. I doubt if that many people really sat through it for 24 hours. But if you read the New Yorker article about him, it drove him nuts making it. So just don't let the 5 hour piece drive you nuts. Have fun making it.
I think I will.
Good. It seems as though you have the right attitude. So it's basically, the next question is about I'm curious your reactions to this. Is a poet, Fanny Howe. She said, the point of art is to show people that life is worth living by showing that it isn't. And I don't know what that means, but it's intrigued me.
Totally intrigues me too, and I think she's really smart. I do like her work. The work I've read, I like a lot. I don't know what that means.
Right.
I mean, actually, could you just say it again? I'd like to hear
it is. And it's always like, I've collected millions of quotes on what is art. My favorite is a Venice artist. The best Venice artist is Duggo. His is art isn't. But this is Fanny Howe. The point of art is to show people that life is worth living by showing that it isn't.
Hmm. I'm going to leave it at.
Yeah, leave it at that. And what the other one is, Mike Kelly, art is making your problems other people's problems. It's like, oy vey.
But that's very Mike.
Yeah, that's very Mike.
That's very Mike. Yeah, and he
So,
was incredibly good at it.
yeah. So
Yeah.
what do you think, or what's your hunch was the motive of the cave artist?
Well, I think this is this idea of representation.
Yeah,
I think the ability to represent is is a language of communication.
yeah,
And so I think those were created to communicate.
yeah,
I don't think they were decorative to make their cave look pretty. I think they were to chronicle or record something
yeah.
that was encountered.
The other thing is, we're doing a project right now on archiving. In so
Mhm.
many people that maybe aren't artists, but are writers, have collected boxes of stuff. Now,
Yeah.
you've collected your art, I'm sure, over the years. Do you have a plan or have thought of a plan? Who's going to take your stuff? Do you just leave it to your friends and family and let them deal with it? Or do you have sort of seen, oh, I've got to look for an archive to store my stuff? So really the question is archiving more innate or more invented? Did the Egyptians say, let's put these things in my coffin for some reason? Like,
Yeah.
and just to go along to flesh it out a bigger is Eastern philosophy is live in the moment. Why should we even worry about what we did in the past when we're trying to live in the moment and move forward, or live in the moment? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are a lot of thoughts on that
Yeah.
actually. And I do think in really recent years, and when I say recent, it's like 50, 60 years. I don't mean it, I'm seriously recent. I think we have come to fetishize our own existences to an unheard of level, where
Yeah.
we fetishize our own shit for
Yeah.
all intents and purposes, and I think that's been brought to our attention by various artists, right?
Yeah.
Who've canned it or
Yeah.
displayed it,
Yeah.
and or drawn it, etc., represented it. Um, I I I think in a funny way, Walter Benjamin was not responsible, but by speaking about the archive and really deeply trying to explore that as an idea, he foresaw and maybe even contributed to ultimately um, the kind of to his horror, I would say, if he had lived it out, um, the idea of speculating and thinking everything has this kind of value, right? Could we call it surplus value because it's been touched or registered by, quote, a certain kind of set of powers?
Yeah.
At this point, with the number of people in the world, uh, I don't know how this can go on. Like, where's everything? We're already not looking at huge amounts of work that museums own. Already, we're not seeing them. They're in storage units. Collectors, quote unquote, the more current collectors, aren't even taking it home. They're putting it in storage units
Yeah.
for its speculative value,
Yeah.
right? And that idea is relatively recent
Yeah.
because it's not acquired for, wow, that's the way I'm going to get to heaven if I own that picture. or
Yeah.
that's the way my brother will become a priest, or that's the way that, it's not for the here and now in a sense, but it is for its value, its surplus value.
Yeah.
And so I hesitate, or I want to call that out. Yeah.
So you mean you haven't really even planned it for your own archive?
I haven't planned it. I've thought about it.
Yeah.
I've thought about it. It feels overwhelming, but the one thing I guess am interested in doing right now is putting things together in a way that someone else will understand.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of interested in putting some books together, where I'm kind of organizing them, and
Yeah.
so I can put my thoughts, in the order that I would like to at least set it up.
Yeah.
If that changes and somebody rearranges it, okay. But
Yeah.
I would like it to be more obvious. Yeah, that my thinking.
I like that idea. To me, it's just there's something about the book, the idea of a book. So, um, a couple things you touched on was when you said canned shit. It's like in fetishizing our own existence, our own shit. Is that indeed the flip is that shit is fertilizer? So then, why did these Egyptians, this is all pre-Benjamin by years, the
Yeah.
Egyptians want to put something in their coffin with them? Is that something innate with humans that we think, or is that something they even invented?
Well, I think that was to make their journey more pleasurable. I mean,
After, you mean their afterlife journey, or their
yeah, the journey there, the
yeah,
journey to the afterlife had to have these things in it to make that journey okay. But
yeah.
we're again talking about only the extremely wealthy. Not everybody else. They didn't get that.
You mean the extremely wealthy, the ruling class of the Egyptians did that.
Yeah,
The others
nobody
didn't.
else got it. They didn't get that stuff.
Yeah. You
That was
really,
so that very particular people could continue into that afterlife.
yeah. That's another great Venetian, Paul Krasner, said, I only believe in reincarnation in one of my past lives. So the other person that you touched on or that evoked was Wyndham Lewis, said, the artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future. So it's sort of like all times are happening now. That's another thing Bo Zapp and Joyce touched on, all at onceness. So
Yeah.
why would we want to have archive? People, like, when I ask that, they go, to study history, so we know we're not, well, we always repeat the past mistakes, but it's just that there's a funny little twist, and your word speculative value really gets me, because it's like, this is when I especially applies to me. When I saw that Norman Mailer years ago was selling his archive for $1 million, I said, geez, I should at least be able to get 100 for mine. And now I've gotten, a college to store all these interviews I've done for 40 years, but it's kind of pay to play. It's not like they're paying me. And I appreciate them doing it and digitizing and storing them. Who knows if it's valuable? I think, this time we've spent talking is very valuable.
I do
And
too.
yeah, and somebody could, if they're writing the book with you, or you're writing the book, or they're writing the book, can reference it. But it still seems, this word that we hasn't come up in our studies of archive for me yet, is fetishizing it. It's like, oh my God, that seems to me like so icky.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, I was, I taught a class for many years called In Context. And what that entailed was having visiting artists speak about their work. And then the following week, the students in the seminar would discuss how they presented, what, all these ideas, and would formulate questions for the next person.
Yeah.
And then they also in that seminar presented their own work on various weeks. And what I think after is, God, I don't even think that happened somewhere in the 90s.
Yeah.
Where the expectation for artists to speak about their work in public was a consumable.
Yeah.
And, I kind of advocated, said, if you don't want to do this, you do it here so that you feel you understand what you're doing. But feel free to say no, if someone asks you to do this. I mean, it used to be that people might just flip through 150 slides and say very little.
Yeah.
I started here and I go there. And there is a really profound shift of kind of almost like a thesis defense, that an artist needed to defend their thesis publicly. And there's some people who just will not do it,
Yeah.
They just won't do it. And
perfect.
I think that's fine, but it's something to make a decision about, to make a choice about. It's not something I think an artist should do by default, like, oh, I must speak about it because, that's the only way, blah, blah, blah. No, there are other ways. Put the work out.
That's funny because Stan Brakhage spoke at Loyola Marymount, or it might have been Otis, but I think it was Loyola, many years before he died, just before he died. And somehow I didn't know about it. And I'm not like a fan of his, but I thought, well, I should go attend. And some friend of mine taped it. And I didn't listen to it. And I've studied him as an experimental filmmaking pioneer, blah, blah, blah. But his great line I always repeat is, let the work speak for itself. And then he would talk for 2 hours about it. And so that's like, you get booked and you get paid more to speak about your art than you're ever going to make as an experimental filmmaking. Doesn't make any money. Sorry.
No, but what it does is I do think that's discourse. And there are people really interested.
Yeah.
In the discursive aspects of the practice of art, right? Because you do learn things from it. You see things. It's a position. It's a proposition you put out. Here's my proposition.
Yeah.
And then there's the kind of response to the proposition. And I think if you're inclined to have that discussion is fantastic. But I don't think it's mandatory.
Yeah.
I think other people can have the discussion even without you.
Yeah.
Because the work does something. And that is potentially separate from the intentions.
Yeah.
Because those things aren't always fully aligned.
Yeah.
Because of the way a work can perform.
Yeah. Yeah, the 2 times I interviewed Mike Kelly, one was at his place, just me and him. And the second time was at Rose Gallery in front of an audience. And I remember I asked him, and I try to ask a full range of questions, not just intelligent ones. The name of my book is Strange Questions. But I asked him, if you were ruler of the world, what would you do on your first day? And I knew it would piss him off. And he literally turned to me and he went, that sounds like a beauty contest question. But then the comments it's on YouTube, in the comments, someone says, the interviewer is problematic. And I was like, thank God somebody got me because I don't want to just be the normal interviewer.
Yeah.
I'm striving to get a little deeper than the stock questions. So here's my big question, Renee, is we only got through half the questions. Can we do a part 2 some way down the road? It'd be 2 or 3, 4 months down the road. And then I'll close out with question number 26. I really appreciate your time and energy. This has been super fun and enlightening for me. I really learned a lot, and I thank you.
Oh my gosh.
And this is funny. Well, this is funny because this question I got from Christine McKenna. Yeah, I mean, you probably read her growing up. She was one of our main interviewers, LA Weekly, and I've interviewed her twice with her own questions, but it's my oldest question, which I got from her, is what's more important, conviction or compromise?
Well, in the grander scheme of things, I would say compromise.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure you can have compromise without conviction.
Yeah.
I think compromise comes from conviction.
Yeah.
If you have no convictions, then there is no compromise. It just doesn't matter. But if you have a conviction, then you have something to compromise.
Yeah. Wow, that's heavy. Yeah, Walter Bullard wrote a book called Operation Mind Control, and he said Really? Wow, that's great. It's the conviction to compromise. But it took 25 years before I said, what's more important, conviction or compromise? This guy goes, depends on what you mean by important. And then it's shifted it from, the two main words that we're sort of focusing on, like your whole ideas. What's the big picture here? What I get from you in talking with you, Renee, is something that resonates with McLuhan's suspended judgment. He says, let's get the big picture. You can say, I like this or dislike this on your own, but when you're with one or more people, if you have suspended judgment, you're going to suss out the bigger picture. So he said, understanding is not having a point of view. So point of view is a funny thing. Like, when did humans invent point of view? Like, oh, I like this or I dislike this. McLuhan's, I think, is crazy. It's funny, but it could be true. When we invented the vanishing point in art, then we started having a point of view.
Yeah, I mean, well, you're also talking about, then again, consciousness.
Yeah.
It's very hard to understand a point of view unless you're actually conscious.
Yeah.
It is dependent, I think, on that, a point of view.
Yeah, I call it like a high awareness level. Some people seem to be like understanding that we're here. And even Bertolt Brecht said, I want art that activates me, not puts me in a trance. But it doesn't mean, and my flip is, well, what about that, 5-hour event you went to, the shadow puppets? That could put you into a trance and you might get an epiphany. You might have an epiphany in the midst of a trance like experience.
Well, yeah, but I think that's, I think that quote of Brecht's shouldn't be taken out of context, because I think what he was after was to break that proscenium, right? That you just watch something, that you actually penetrated it. So
yeah,
actors turn to the audience and speak directly to them using the second person,
right,
or the first person. Then you're in a really different. It's a really different proposition. So I think it's hard to extract that kind of statement and see it as, let's say, separate from what he was fully invested in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the problem when I take all these quotes out of context. It's so much deeper. when the person's allowed to explain it, but there's just sort of like prompts. So
Yeah,
that was,
I see
yeah,
that, and it was a prompt, I think, even for me to be, to think about the specificity of that. You
yeah,
know, I, in fact, was recently, and I was commenting that in that new film, the Barbie film, the speech that comes up by Ferrara is really a Brechtian moment. It might be Greta Gerwig, I think, the director, acknowledging both Godard and Brecht when
wow,
that character turns to the screen and gives a speech. That
wow, I
was
didn't know this.
kind of Godard really broke that using that type of Brechtian uh, moment, I guess you could say.
That's heavy because so Brecht did it before Thornton Wilder. Who did it first, Thornton Wilder or Brecht?
I'm not sure. I thought
But
it was, but I'm
Brecht
not.
probably did it first. But
Yeah.
it's interesting because that's Ryan Johnson said he became a filmmaker because he saw McLuhan in Woody Allen's film Annie Hall. And that's when Woody turns to the audience in the sitting in the movie theater and talks to them. It's like, you're not supposed to do that, and breaks that fourth wall. So I didn't know that happened in the Barbie film. Yeah, because I haven't seen it yet. So I'm like joyously discussing it with people in and out because I study all the analysis on it. And my friend goes, well, have you seen it? I goes, no, I don't have to see it. And she's going, well, how can you talk about it if you haven't seen it? I goes, look there's so much online that psychoanalyzes it. Eventually I might see it, but I probably won't. But now I got that Brecht moment. I didn't know that. So thank you. But it's like, because you have the scene in Venice is intense for me because when she clocks that homeless guy who gropes her, I said, I probably know that homeless guy. But the LA Times had that article last week, the most analyzed film in the history of cinema, Barbie.
Whoa. Is that true?
That was a headline. Well, now I don't know if it's true. How could you ever measure that? But just to have that as your headline, I mean, I say all the power to Greta. She scored. She got people to talk about something. People they don't even know the word patriarchy, and it's shoved in your face, and so.
I think in many ways there were ideas and even, let's say techniques and styles that are so discursive. I mean, I think that happens sometimes with Tarantino too.
Yeah.
That he's so evocative of past filmmakers.
Yeah.
And brings them, right in the door.
Yeah.
That you need to reflect on those kinds of ideas of how there's a conversation within the film about film. There's a kind of reflexivity.
The reflexivity is what McLuhan got from Finnegan's Wake. It's called Menippean satire. It's using the medium itself like that. Yeah.
That's right.
So Renee, thank you again so much. This has been truly enlightening. I learned so much, and I'll send you some possible dates for a future one down the road, and we can do a part 2.
I would love to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really
fun. Terry. It was really great to meet you.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.